Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Ayesha Ramachandran, an assistant professor of comparative literature at Yale University. She's a literary and cultural historian of early modern Europe and primarily concerned with transnational encounters and the early mechanisms of globalization from the late 15th to the early 18th centuries. Today we'll talk with Professor Ramachandran about her book, The Worldmakers, Global Imagining in Early Modern Europe. Welcome, Professor Ramachandran.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, let's start with an overview of your book, and this is your first book, yes?
This is.
Okay,
so
congratulations.
to see it between covers.
Yes. So give us an overview of it and what the premise is.
So the book is largely about the culture and literature and new science of early modern Europe, so the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's interested in the way the concept world as a comprehensive category of totality and everything came to have its modern form. So we think of this term as being completely self-explanatory. We think of it as referring to our globe. We think of it as, individual worlds. We think of it as having both multiple meanings and particular geographic meanings. And we often don't think that this idea itself, that this term world means these things, has a history. And so my book is really teasing out the history of this term and attempting to go back to the moment of the kind of very beginning of globalization to think about how we evolved this modern concept of world.
Okay, and what was the kernel that, sparked the book for you?
It's such a funny story. I wrote my dissertation on imagined worlds in literary texts. So my PhD is in Renaissance studies, a very kind of literary topic. And so I was interested in fictional works in the 16th and 17th century that imagined other worlds. And then I asked myself, well, why do all these texts have these weird otherworldly imaginings in it? And so as somebody who's very interested in history and whose training is broadly historical, I began to think more about this question. Why do these sort of artifacts, these art and sort of literary objects, begin to think in these otherworldly terms? And of course, one very obvious answer is, well, this is the moment of the expansion of the world, the discovery of the Americas, new planets, all of these things. And then I also discovered that just lexically, in terms of language, what the meaning of a term like world meant radically changes. And so before the 16th century, world still refers to the thing that God made. It's an idea very closely linked to a theological concept, and it also has moral overtones. So somebody who is worldly is somebody who's corrupt and too interested in things of the world and material things and not interested enough in spiritual matters. And then something changes in the 16th and 17th century when that theological, spiritual, moral idea gives way to a more, what we might say, kind of secular, geographic, economic, commercial idea. And so I became very interested in tracing that shift. And on the other hand, in my field, in literary studies, but also in history, we've been very interested in the last 25 years in globalization. Okay. But that turn towards globalization has been driven largely by interests in economic history, in political histories, broadly, say, histories of sort of society and migration. But there hasn't been that much attention to the kind of conceptual question of, how do we even get to thinking in global terms, right? We think about Europe being a kind of small, closed world to itself, that it can then imagine something that is bigger than itself, and the kind of complexities intellectually and philosophically that come into play. So my book, in some ways, is a counterpoint to studies of globalization that think largely in these sorts of economic, commercial, political terms, and offers a more, I would say, kind of a philosophical, cultural complement to thinking about those questions.
Okay. And how did you do what was the methodology for the book? How did you do the research?
So this is a book that is odd in some ways because it doesn't quite fit into any clear discipline. It's a very interdisciplinary book. It moves from looking at the cartographic revolution, so the making of the first world maps, to thinking about the first autobiographies, to thinking about epic poetry, to thinking about the new science, to thinking about the kind of conflict between religion and science. So it draws on a number of different fields, and part of that is my training as somebody in Renaissance studies, the sort of hybrid interdisciplinary degree. and also somebody who is, I'm very interested conceptually in going back to this pre-Enlightenment moment when we did not have disciplines in the way we understand them today. So the methodology of the book is itself an attempt to get past these disciplinary barriers that in some ways make it difficult for us to recover this kind of more amorphous history. And so it's partly historical, it's partly philosophical, it's partly literary analysis, so if I had to really give it a kind of disciplinary clarity, I would say it's somewhere between history and philosophy, with a lot of literary methodology thrown in. But on the other hand, I look at a lot of visual texts. So, so its goal really is to cut past what I think of as a kind of deep intellectual historical divide around the 18th century, when we began to have these separate disciplines where you could not write a kind of comprehensive, multifaceted history of anything because you were really increasingly narrow and specialized, and that's the history of our academy too. So this book is an attempt to kind of push past that, to go back into the kind of head of the 16th century scholar who thought in this more kind of multifaceted way. And so the book brings that to bear. Okay,
so you're starting basically in the 1600s,
yes.
So
in the 1500s, in the 16th century,
okay. So what were the earliest inklings that became apparent to you for this changing kind of way to look at the world?
So the most obvious place people go for this is, of course, the discovery of this, the so-called discovery of the New World, right? I mean, when Europeans come to the Americas for the first time, there is the sense that, oh my God, there is this other big continent. Of course, it takes about 150 years for people to even realize it is a continent.
Right,
I mean, they think it's an island for a long time. And, you know, what is a continent is itself an idea that's in flux. But one of the less, I mean, it's not just the excitement of finding, you know, this new source of wealth and, you know, all of the kind of really horrific things that go with European colonization at that point. But there are other important conceptual changes that brings about. For instance, Europeans thought that they knew what things were like in their world. And so the sort of eruption of the New World into European consciousness is also a sign that we don't know, and that perhaps we cannot know, and perhaps our certainties in all these other areas are also possibly under attack. It's just that we haven't quite gotten that knowledge yet. So there's a kind of double sense of real terror, the fact that all our old certainties are perhaps not so certain, and also a real excitement that there is the possibility for these things we didn't know, for us to know them now, right? So that moment is conceptual. It's not just the kind of fact of discovery, but it's the conceptual consequences of discovery that I'm really interested in, right? It also means other things. It means that, well, you know, why does the Bible not describe these people of the New World? And where did they come from? I mean, how did Adam's successors get across the Atlantic? I mean, it just creates all of these questions that to us seem kind of crazy questions to even be asking, but they disturb really fundamental ways that people imagine the cosmos was organized. So that's the kind of first moment, and then out of that come all of these new kinds of questions that in themselves lead to new sorts of inquiry.
Okay, and you look at specific people throughout history, and those are the world makers. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Right, so I use this term world makers, which in some ways historians find somewhat anachronistic because it's a term that's closely linked to contemporary philosophy as a way of looking at the world not as being this kind of realistic thing, but the possibility that our experience of the world is subjective, perspectival. But I find that the history of that term, world maker, is actually a very old one, and it's one that's born in the late 16th century as people came to use that word in English for the first time to talk about the idea that the world is made, right, that it's actually an artifact. So the term world maker is invented in the late 16th century, and it's part of hybrids like playwright and wheelwright and Cartwright, right, people who make something. So the idea then is that the world is something that is made. It was previously believed to have been made by God, and we're in a period in which people are beginning to wonder if the world can be made by humans, right? And so that conceptual shift is part of what I'm interested in using this term world maker. So the people I talk about, and I really talk about 5 different figures who become representative of particular fields in which this kind of major intellectual shift is happening. So the first person I talk about is Gerhard Mercator, who we know from the Mercator projection, the projection that was made possible navigation across deep ocean water navigation, who made this map in the late 16th century that we now think of as being this kind of iconic map of the world. But Mercator's life and his career tracks the entire 16th century. So, and his interest in imagining both what the world and the cosmos look like goes beyond the geographic. He's very interested in theological questions, is interested in kind of cosmic, what we might think of as physics right now. So I look at this, and through the lens of his life and work, I both trace how the image of the world on a map comes to be born in the 16th century. Like, how does that vision of the world that we think of on maps be drawn for the first time, when you have to remember that people like Mercator never went anywhere. They lived in the same small places in Europe. They gathered information from sailors and diplomats and drawings of friends, and made these maps as this kind of supreme feat of imagination. I mean, today we have, you know, GPS and satellites and pictures from outer space, but until the Apollo expedition in the late 60s, we had no actual corroboration that these maps that began to be made in the 16th century actually looked anything like what the Earth looked like, right? So I'm interested in the kind of imaginative leap that links to science and mathematics in this period that produces this new vision of the world. And then I look at a very famous French humanist figure, Michel de Montaigne, whose book, The Essays, could be considered one of the first modern autobiographies. But I'm interested in how autobiography, which is really the writing of oneself and one individual, in Montaigne's work becomes a kind of writing of the world. So the ways in which people talk about the world, or in terms of cosmography, literally writing the world, become the ways in which Montaigne talks about the self. So the self becomes a mirror of the world, but also an extension of it, right? So there's this kind of interesting reconstruction of the relationship between the individual and the surrounding world that happens in these essays. And so I tease that out. I have a third chapter that looks at the epic poems of Edmund Spenser, a kind of important English epic poet, and Camões, an important Portuguese epic poet. And Camões' poem is about the discovery of the sea route to India. And Spenser's poem is an imagination of what British Empire might look like long before Britain ever had an empire. So that this becomes a chapter where I look at these epic poems that imagine versions of empire, both historical and imagined, and I use that to think about how world making is fundamentally the prelude to what will become the imperial projects of the 18th century and beyond. So I think they're about how the idea of the world is both conducive to empire but also dwarfs empire, right? So they're kind of scales of order. We have the nation, we have empire, and we have world, and I think about how these three terms actually are constantly in interplay in the period. I then have a chapter on Descartes, kind of a major sort of father of modern philosophy. But I write Descartes' very first work that he kind of held on to for his entire life, though he never published, is a work called The World. And he was about to publish it in 1632 when Galileo was placed under house arrest. And so he suppresses the publication of this work called The World. But the work he did, the scientific work that went into this kind of reimagination really of what we would now call physics, or what was called natural philosophy, went into all of his other major works. So we know the Discourse on Method, and we know the Meditations, and the work that really underpins these kind of watershed texts in the history of philosophy and science come out of this work that he called The World. And so I'm interested in kind of recreating why it is that he calls this work The World, how this work actually mirrors Genesis itself, and how kind of he realized how complicated it would be to publish something like this in the climate of the 1630s, and why that work then takes this different form in Descartes' other writings. So I sort of tease out here again the beginnings of the new science and its connection to these older ideas of philosophy, and how it paves the way for other ways of thinking, both scientifically and in terms of the conflict between religion and science. And the final chapter is on John Milton's Paradise Lost. And I come to this text that everybody knows and reads in school, in college and in school, by really asking the question, why should we write a poem about Genesis in the late 1660s? You know, this is well past Copernicus, it's past Descartes, we're in the world of the new science. Why go back to this creation story? And so I argue here that Paradise Lost is really a rewriting of Genesis for a post-Cartesian age. That what happens when we have this new version of world, Milton is the first poet, one might say, to imagine an infinite universe, where Milton's universe is expansive, spacious, infinite. And how does that square with narratives of Genesis that have seemed to be in conflict with this new idea of the cosmos and of the world, not just understood as our Earth, but understood as our universe? So I look there again at the kind of imaginative play that's required in some ways to hold on both to the idea of religion and creation stories, but also what it means to kind of embrace the new imagination of an infinite universe.
So through the course of your studying these time periods, can you pinpoint, or not necessarily pinpoint, but approximate when we finally kind of had a close approximation to what we think of as the world now?
That's a great question. So I think it's a two-step process. I think by the end of the 16th century, we have a pretty good sense of our world as an Earth, as a kind of geographic idea. And that sort of roughly corresponds to the rise of the world atlas as a genre, a new kind of book. And I think the second phase of that is the expansion of that geographic concept out of the kind of sphere of the Earth into the cosmos. And that is what we see in the 17th century. So I think that there are these kind of two watershed moments where for the first time people understand the world to be a combination literally of land and water. I mean, in geography before the late 16th century, you think of land and water as two separate things. You don't think of them as kind of a hybrid integrated body. And that conceptual shift is the kind of first important moment. And then to kind of push that imagination outward into the universe is the second. And so one nice example of this is Columbus becomes such an important figure in the narratives of discovery, right? I mean, he's the one who crossed the ocean. And that image of Columbus, the discoverer, is an image that's adopted by Galileo when he speaks of his own discovery of the, of Jupiter and the moons of Jupiter. And that sense of expanding this terrestrial metaphor of, sailors going to other places into the universe, right? I mean, that you think of these angels in Milton's text traversing space as being sailors across the oceans, right? I mean, since it's the kind of import of one kind of metaphor into another sphere that also suggests quite literally a kind of imaginative expansion.
Right. So what do you conclude ultimately in your book, and what would you like readers to take away from your book?
So I think two things. I mean, in some ways, this is a descriptive history. It's an attempt to kind of recover a way of thinking that we have come to take for granted completely. And so I guess I would say there are two takeaways. I mean, one is, this is a book that responds to a transformative moment now. We are, I think, very much in a kind of similar moment of trying to tease out how that idea of world might itself be changing. And I think much of the emphasis on an interest in globalization comes out of this sort of attempt to make sense of our own moment and the kinds of radical changes that we see. And part of what I want to suggest is that our sense of flux today, when we're confronted with the idea of globalization, itself has a history. And that if we go back and think of that problem itself historically, we might recognize some of the strategies that were used, 400 years ago, that paradoxically we find ourselves using. So I end the book actually by thinking about Google Earth and the fascination that people have with using Google Earth as being analogous to the excitement of people using the first maps in the world and world atlases, right? What does that mean of our own sense of ourselves in space? And so I really do believe that one of the things that historical study offers us is that sense of reflecting on where we are now. The second really important takeaway I think from the book is that we have spent so much time thinking about concepts like world in largely what I would call social science terms, in terms of economics and politics. And that's really important and, of course, crucial in terms of the way our lives are structured. What we have lost, and what I think that someone like me working in comparative literature can bring to the question, is the kind of imaginative conceptual work that underlies the making of these big concepts. And so my book places a lot of emphasis on the kind of imaginative and speculative leaps that people have to make to get from one theoretical paradigm to another, right? And not just material sort of shifts of institutions and nations, but people have to actually imagine themselves there first, right? I mean, science doesn't just happen. It's because someone actually sat down and thought, I can do this differently, let me think about how. And there are a lot of mistakes along the way. So part of what my book wants to recover is that sense of excitement, the kind of importance of the imagination, the importance of conceptual speculation, all of which we now think of as being kind of in the humanities or kind of related to the arts. And this is a book that really talks about the kind of integrated work that the arts and the sciences do together. The importance of speculation and the imagination for diplomacy and politics, right? And we have separated those two things out. And part of the takeaway of the book, I think, is how much we have to gain from going back and kind of bringing those relationships back together.
Very good. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. For more information about Professor Ramachandran and her work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. you.